You may have heard the old adage, there's no such thing as bad publicity, and I'll admit, there's a certain intuitive logic to this statement that kind of makes it seem like it might actually be true. In marketing, and especially publicity, one of the worst things a brand can do is be quiet, because it leads people to think that you're either unimportant, past your prime, or even worse, out of the game entirely. You see this happen all the time with movie stars, popular musicians, and celebrities. Nearly every month, there'll be someone who hasn't been in the limelight for decades who passes away and who prompts the public to remember whatever they were notable for. And inevitably, you'll hear people confess, I thought they were already dead because I haven't heard about them in years. By contrast, the comedy legend Mel Brooks is turning 100 this weekend, but because he just had a documentary come out about him last year, and he released History of the World Part 2 in 2023, and he's been publicly involved with a sequel to his popular 1980s spoof film Spaceballs, the reaction of the public has largely been, wow, he's still working hard no matter how old he gets. But then, Mel Brooks may be a special case. After all, one of his most classic gags from the 1950s, that's back when he was in his 30s, by the way, was his character called the 2,000-year-old man. Being old has always been a part of his brand. But, speaking of brands, let's turn our attention to marketing, because there have been a lot of brands announcing bad news lately. For example, M&M's has announced that they're phasing out blue and brown M&M's as they move away from artificial food dyes. Volkswagen just announced it's laying off 100,000 workers and may close 4 factories. And this is just one of many companies that has announced massive layoffs this year, and yet still seems to be viable as a brand. Apple just announced that it is raising the prices of its MacBook and iPad due to the cost of chips and memory, and this problem has affected many other technology companies as well, including the game maker Valve, which is seeing standoffish reviews of its surprisingly pricey Steam Machine living room PC and game console hybrid. And Microsoft. Microsoft. They've not only announced a 100-year price hike on their Xbox consoles, but also, they've seen their stock price hit a 1-year low due to investor concerns about how much money they've been burning on AI. But all of these companies are still around and probably will be for a while. A little bad news isn't going to bring them down. It turns out that if you manage bad publicity right, a brand can survive an awful lot. So, you know what? Let's take a look at what really brings brands down when bad publicity is on the horizon, and how a disciplined approach can save a brand from complete ruin. I'm Sean in St. Louis, and this is The Marketing Gateway. Bad publicity can happen very suddenly, and its effects can last for decades. Just down the street from my house, there are 2 restaurants that have endured a lot of bad publicity. One of them is Jack in the Box, which is part of a national chain that had an E. coli epidemic in 1992 and 1993 that caused 732 people to get very sick, and which killed 4 children. The restaurant near my house wasn't to blame. This all happened in California, Idaho, Washington State, Nevada, but it was all due to contaminated meat. Even so, my parents refused to take us to the local Jack in the Boxes for years after that because they were worried that it wasn't a safe place to eat. And yet, over 30 years later, the chain is still around and has a strong safety record. And while there are fewer of them here in St. Louis than there used to be, you can still find a Jack in the Box restaurant if you really want to. More recently, at the Longhorn Steakhouse in Fairview Heights, Illinois, over 150 people reported food poisoning from the Shigella bacteria in September and October of 2024, and a dozen even had to be hospitalized. The restaurant is a chain, and this particular outbreak was limited to this location, but this wasn't just a small outbreak, it made national news. The restaurant temporarily closed for cleaning and retraining the staff and reopened after being cleared by the Illinois Department of Public Health later that month. But even so, you didn't see too many people going there when it opened back up. But you know what? I passed by it the other night and it was packed. I was really surprised memories are so short, or, perhaps that the desire for eating steak at Longhorn Steakhouse is so high. In either event, the business seems to have weathered the bad news, and I haven't seen any news suggesting that Longhorn has been negatively impacted. Quite the contrary, in fact. The chain just hit $1 billion in quarterly sales. Apparently, that's thanks to TikTok, by the way, because there's been a lot of chatter on there about Longhorn's lamb chops. Who knew a steakhouse even served lamb? But my bigger question is, How did both of these restaurants survive these crises? Because food poisoning is not a trivial thing. Restaurants get shut down all the time for poor sanitation and food handling processes, and they can be held legally responsible for food poisoning if it's shown that they were negligent in how they prepared or stored food. I've not seen any specific playbook from Longhorn Steakhouse reported anywhere, but I can deduce from the many articles I've read that they made some good choices by immediately cooperating with local officials, keeping their employees away from the media, and generally saying as little as possible beyond their narrative that they were shocked by the outbreak and were taking every measure possible to prevent another one from reoccurring. I never heard anyone at Longhorn blame anyone else or publicly say that they were holding anyone accountable. I also have not heard that they've admitted any fault or taken any blame, which would of course have legal consequences. I'm sure changes happened behind the scenes and some heads rolled as a result of the outbreak, but their public message seemed to be that illness happens. They were taking the situation seriously to prevent it from happening again, and they were going to remain open for business. It's honestly stunning how a disciplined approach like that can work. I'm sure there are people in the area who refuse to eat there now, but I also know that as the years go by, if there's not another outbreak, people will gradually forget about it. It'll be a fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, shame on me kind of situation. Their response was almost certainly informed by the Jack in the Box situation from 30 years ago. Because the 4 people who died were children, the family of one of the victims, Riley Detweiler, became the face of the tragedy and soon were at the White House giving a television town hall with President Clinton. The crisis had a huge impact on how meat inspections were done going forward and also prompted the installation of an E. coli surveillance system administered by the CDC. And Jack in the Box not only took a major hit to its stock price and saw sales decreases of up to 30%, but also had to pay out over $50 million to settle over 100 lawsuits. Jack in the Box also had to spend the latter part of the 1990s rehabbing its image, which it did, with a savvy and popular advertising campaign featuring their fictional executive, Jack Box, a man in a suit and tie wearing a giant spherical clown head resembling their classic mascot with a yellow hat, blue dot eyes, conical black nose, and red curved smile. The message was not, hey, we messed up and we're better now, but rather, that was then and this is now. And this shows a rather savvy understanding that old news and bad news are not the same thing, especially in the United States, where failing is not seen as a disqualification for doing business with brands that you otherwise like. Having your brand name endlessly repeated in the media is actually a positive thing for building brand awareness, and consumer research consistently shows that when consumers are faced with choosing between a brand they don't know and a brand that they do know, familiarity is often a major factor in their decision-making. In fact, what usually takes brands down during crises is not the bad news itself, but their response to it. Brands that take accountability for their mistakes and take corrective action in compliance with laws and regulations are generally better off than those who ignore the problem, shut down critical voices, antagonize regulators, and behave as if they are not concerned about correcting the issue. And bad press is very uncomfortable to endure, particularly in the era of cancel culture. When you have a crisis happening and it feels like everyone has turned their ire on you, it's hard to have a disciplined approach of saying, you know, there was a mistake, we accept the feedback, and we're working with the appropriate authorities to ensure we're compliant going forward. And that is, by the way, the general playbook many PR consultants advise, because it doesn't admit fault, doesn't shame anyone, and points to forward progress. No, what tends to happen instead is those organizations receiving bad press often respond wildly and unpredictably, feeling a knee-jerk need to blame victims, to point fingers, and deflect blame onto others, to ignore any hint of criticism and to angrily insist that they were innocent of wrongdoing. And while the public is generally not too attuned to bad news, people do pay attention to bad behavior. And that sort of thing can create an endless amount of interest that won't go away and which will tarnish your brand permanently. One contemporary example is a Lego resale chain called Bricks and Minifigs, which has recently been in the public eye. Bricks and Minifigs is not associated with the Lego group, by the way. They're independent and based corporately in Utah. The situation began with a franchise store in Oregon that was selling a private collection of Lego Star Wars sets on consignment. The owners sold their store, and things turned into a much larger debacle when the new franchise owners decided to claim those sets for themselves and stiff the collection owner out of the proceeds, which he was planning to use to fund his grandchildren's college educations. The collection was valued in the hundreds of thousands of dollars, and the collector was able to demonstrate that the new franchise owners were selling his sets by sending in a friend to buy one of them. But the franchise owners and the corporation refused to return the sets or compensate the collector. The story drew international attention thanks to a YouTuber named Reckless Ben, who decided to try to help the situation with a series of absurd stunts that even got the Utah police involved in a manner that really reflects well on no one. And the situation is now so out of control due to all of its twists and turns that it seems unlikely that Bricks and Minifigs brand will ever fully recover from it. Now, I've put everyone's side of the story in the show notes, and as of yesterday, the situation does seem to be cooling down following some unpopular legal action against Reckless Ben. But to make a long story short, things would have gone a lot more smoothly if lawyers and PR representatives had been consulted early on, rather than later when the story spilled over into the court of public opinion. Bricks and Minifigs now looks to many people like a brand that was happy to steal from a private collector, and which was brought to justice by a young YouTuber. And now celebrities and prominent voices have also weighed in to call on Bricks and Minifigs to just make things right and give the collector his remaining Lego sets back and compensate him for what they sold. To date, the corporation has done no such thing, and it's honestly pretty crazy to think that a multi-million-dollar retail franchise would squabble with the internet hordes and ruin its brand over a collection that at most is worth about $200,000. So, what has Bricks and Minifigs done wrong? They weren't willing to let bad news become old news, and they also weren't willing to take the disciplined step of correcting the mistake and instituting oversight to prevent it from happening again. They instead added fuel to the fire and created a situation where many would-be customers who love Lego toys will probably skip their stores going forward. And online searches for Bricks and Minifigs are very likely to continue to show the controversy and Reckless Ben's videos because so many people have engaged with the controversy. Could Bricks and Minifigs survive and see all these negative mentions of their brand name build awareness of their brand over time? It's possible, though I think they're going to have to do a better job than they have. Because at the end of the day, it's not bad publicity that brings brands down. It's consistently bad behavior and a lack of accountability. I'm Sean in St. Louis, and this has been the Marketing Gateway. We'll see you next time. So our plug this month is for animal welfare and rescue. And I'm not going to mention any one particular organization as a place that I want you to designate your attention because there are so many that are in need. And whether you have a local animal shelter or humane society or a place that's doing trap and release or anything along those lines, there's always a need to donate to help support the care and rehabilitation of animals in your area. One group that I do like to donate to is Stray Rescue of St. Louis. They are very well regarded in terms of their reputation. They have a 90% score on Charity Navigator, and they do a great job of getting to know the animals within, especially the urban areas that have been abused or neglected or just set loose. I've gotten loose from careless owners or things like that. And they help these animals to begin to trust humans again and to find forever homes. And I respect and admire their mission so much. But there are many other animal groups out there as well that are looking after and caring for animals that have been discarded. Now, I want to say, I'm an animal lover, and there are many cats and dogs and other adoptable pets out there that people get with great intentions. You know, when they're puppies or kittens, they're cute, right? They're fun to have, but they can't care for them properly. And instead of trying to find a good forever home for these pets, they'll go out and they'll drop them off in the woods, or they'll just kind of let them go loose in their neighborhood or things like that. And this almost always is one of the worst things you can do for these animals because they wind up coming back to where humans are living because they're dependent on humans for food. They get in fights with other pets. They get in fights with wildlife. They get hit by cars. A lot of bad things can happen. And the people that are out there watching for these animals, caring for them, having compassion for them are people that I respect and admire like you wouldn't believe. So again, I want you to take some time, research your local animal welfare organizations in your area, and be sure to give, because especially during the summer, these animals are threatened like you wouldn't believe by the heat and by just all the additional activity that's going on. And so anything you can do to help will make sure that these animals get another chance at a great life.